Okay, guys, so let's get started with this chapter for Zoom review. First, I want to say thank you to everyone who is here today. And please, during this presentation, let me know if you have any questions at any time. For those of you who are joining for the first time, I'm just going to go over the chapter 4 review questions for exam 2, and then I will open up the floor for questions to go over any other topics. So with Zoom being a little difficult, it's going to take me some time to share my screen and switch from whatever I'm talking about. So just bear with me during this time. But yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and let's see, share my screen. And first I want to show you the, let's see, oh, it's over here. Let me try that again. Let's see. Share my screen. We're going to share this screen. Okay, so here is our exam 2 review. If you're looking on Blackboard and you can't find it in week 5 and 6, it's in week 7 and 8. But it is open and available even though we're not in that week yet. But that's where you can find this. So this is available on Blackboard. But yeah, we're just going to talk about chapter 4. So you already took your first exam, and for a lot of you, it may have been a little bit difficult. And it was a hard exam, but I think chapter 4 is a little bit easier. I think skeletal muscle is easier to understand. So let's kind of get into the major topics of this chapter. So you already submitted your assignment, and as you can see here, some of the questions you'll see on the exam you already answered on your assignment. So you should be well versed in that material. All your assignments are graded already. Most everyone did really great and earned all 10 points, so good job on that. But yeah, let's just kind of start. I'm going to switch my screen now to the PowerPoint, and I won't pull up this screen again. So if you want to have this picture or this document pulled up, please do so. If not, I'll just kind of follow and go along with all that. Yeah, so let's get to, again, give me a second. New share. Let's share the PowerPoint. Okay. So starting kind of from the very beginning. Yeah, so first thing is layers of connective tissue. This should be a pretty easy topic because you already wrote about it on your assignment. So you kind of explained each layer, kind of what the function of them were. And since you've written about it, you'll now be able to answer multiple choice questions about it. So yeah, that's pretty simple. It's just talking about what is the epimysium, or tell me about the paramysium. So it's just answering questions about those 3 layers. You don't have to know anything in depth that I talked about in the lecture. Mainly just what's on the slides is what you'll have to know for the exam. So it's just being able to differentiate between the 3 layers. Next, as we kind of move through, you won't have a question on the stretch shortening cycle or the stretch-induced force deficit. You did answer that on the assignment, but you don't have to worry about that question on the exam. Next, kind of what you'll have to know about is the basic structure of the sarcomere and kind of all the components that are comprised in it. These questions are easy because they're going to be just kind of straight up definition questions. So such as like, what is the smallest basic contractile unit of muscle tissue, which is the sarcomere? So knowing about that, also knowing what creates this striated appearance. So you have to know what causes these lines right here that we see. And we already know it's the arrangement of the myofilaments, which is actin and myosin. So what you'll have to know is just the difference between actin and myosin. So all the dissimilarities between the two. You'll have to know the difference between tropomyosin and troponin, which we go into more detail on this side about troponin. So troponin I, C, and T. You do have to know the difference between all three of the subtypes of troponin. Next is the myosin filament here. So you do have to know about what makes up the myosin filament, such as the globular head. Also, what is the globular head made of? It says it right here, myosin ATPase, that's an enzyme. Just kind of knowing how the myosin filament works, what's its role in muscle contraction. Next here is knowing about our non-contractile proteins. So also remember that troponin and tropomyosin are also considered non-contractile, but those two are regulatory proteins. Titin and nebulin, as you see here, are structural proteins. So it is knowing the difference between the two. We know that titin is going to work with myosin. We know that nebulin is going to work with actin. Another major component of titin is how it limits range of motion, contributes to passive stiffness that we feel in the muscle during a stretch. So knowing those differences there. So like I said, those questions are pretty simple when it comes to identifying because they're kind of just definitions. Next, though, we get into the different bands or zones. This is basically how we label the sarcomere, how we separate the different components. So first, knowing about the A band. Knowing that this gray area is the A band, that it just consists of the entire myosin molecule. Also knowing about the I bands, how the I bands only consist of actin. They're on the very ends of the sarcomere. And then knowing about the H zone. The H zone also contains myosin, but it does not contain any actin. And then here, we already probably know the Z lines or disc are the boundaries, the very end, and the M line is the middle. So you don't only have to know what each of those, I guess, components, where they are on the sarcomere, you also have to know what happens to them with a contraction. So like it says here, we know the A band does not change because the myosin molecule doesn't change. We do know the H zone disappears because actin slides into it. We know the I band shorten because the entire sarcomere is shortening, and the Z lines also get closer to the M line. So yeah, that's kind of what you have to know about those different zones. So kind of moving on to part 2. So this is steps in the sliding filament theory. This was also asked on your assignment. You had to explain the excitation, contraction, coupling phase. The importance of doing that on your assignment was so you have all the information, or you're very familiar with those steps. So when you see a question over this topic on the exam, you can identify which step is incorrect, which step may be out of order, or which step is just completely wrong. So that's the importance of answering that question on the assignment. You now are familiar with the steps of the sliding filament theory, or the main part of that theory. So I'm not going to really go over all of this. If you need to hear me talk about it again, just refer back to the lecture. But yeah, so a pretty important part is knowing what happens. I also went over those steps and I applied it to the actual muscle fiber and showed how it activates the myofilaments. So again, refer back to the lecture if you need that. This part here just goes into more detail about each of those phases, and then we have the last 2 phases here. Another question you may see in regards to the sliding filament theory is if I have like this statement right here. So myosin head detaches from actin binding site, recocks and reattaches to actin. You may have to know, where does that occur? Does it occur in the resting phase, or the relaxation phase, or the contraction phase? So kind of knowing where those steps fall. So in step 1, 2, 3, or 4. So yeah, that's kind of all you really have to know about the sliding filament theory. Next, we get into proprioception, talking about muscle spindles and GTOs. You also already talked about this on your assignment, so you should be very familiar with number 1, what is proprioception? How does it contribute to us learning a skill? And then function of muscle spindles versus GTOs. So you do have to understand these in detail, though. You do have to understand, you have to think of 4 questions maybe on this entire concept, knowing what their main role is, knowing what happens to them with contraction, knowing which one causes the contraction, which one causes the relaxation. So knowing the major differences between the two there. Okay, so, whoops. Next is, next is fiber type. So again, you also wrote about this on your assignment number 5. So that was your critical thinking question. You not only had to talk about the characteristics of type 1 versus type 2, but you had to talk about the benefits of maybe possessing more type 1 or possessing more type 2 fibers. So there are benefits to having a high percentage of type 1 versus 2, and you already talked about that. So questions you'll see on the exam, mainly are going to be about characteristics. So if I list a bunch of characteristics, knowing that's type 1 or 2, or maybe asking you to identify which of the following is not a characteristic of type 1 or type 2. So knowing these 2 basic slides here is important, but this slide where it just basically breaks down the characteristics, that's what's going to be probably the most helpful in understanding which one possesses more. I know I talked about a type 2A fiber in this lecture, but versus a type 2X, but you really don't have to know the difference. I think I talked about it on this slide right here, but you don't have to know the difference really between the two. You just have to know type 2 fibers as like a class of fibers. But yeah. So yeah, just kind of knowing basics. You don't have to know anything about the staining procedures. You may have a question about transition of fiber types between like the type X versus the type A, and how it can't transition to a type 1. And you just have to know that it's due to the myosin heavy chain content. How type 2X and A have very similar MHC, but type 1, it's completely different. So that's one reason why they can't transition from one to the other. Okay, moving on. So next is muscle actions. So with muscle actions, we probably are already very familiar with isometric, concentric, and eccentric actions. So that's great. You do have to know just like the basic definition of those, but you also have to be able to identify which muscle is performing an eccentric or concentric action during a movement. So I think there may be 2 questions like this on the exam, where let's say I give you a person doing back squat, and I say, you know, they're moving downward, which muscle is performing the eccentric action? So you would know that the quadriceps are stretching, they're lengthening, so they're eccentrically acting. Or a question like if I'm throwing a baseball, during the follow through phase or during the throw, which muscle is performing the concentric action? So the shortening of the muscle. The way to answer this question is to identify the target muscle first. So if I give you an action, either, you know, downward, upward, throwing, identify the target muscle and then figure out, is that muscle shortening or is that muscle lengthening? And so that'll help you answer those questions. Continuing with those actions, you also have to know these terms right here. So these terms, we have isotonic, isokinetic, isoinertial, DCER, and variable resistance. So again, it's just definitions. I'm not going to ask you anything that's not on the slides right here. So it's just kind of identifying the differences. You may have like an example. So like if I'm using bands or chains during a resistance move exercise to alter the resistance, you know that's going to be variable resistance. Or if I'm on a device and the velocity of my limb is held constant, you know I'm on an isokinetic device. So just kind of questions about those terms. All right, so this next part is where I think it gets a little bit trickier. It's understanding these different curves. And we learned about a lot of curves and relationships in the latter part of this chapter. So I'm going to briefly go over these again and just kind of exactly what you need to know. So first is the force velocity curve. This curve really, and the title of kind of each relation or each curve or relationship basically tells you what we're talking about. We're obviously talking about force and velocity and how the force produced is going to change as the velocity of the movement changes. So in this picture right here, we're looking at eccentric versus concentric force production during a shortening velocity or a lengthening velocity. So let's take the concentric part first. So we know concentric is shortening. The best way you can think of that is, let's just think of a bicep curl. So that muscle is going to shorten. So this here shows that the velocity is increasing during a concentric movement. The force is going to be lower the faster the velocity becomes. One of the main reasons is there's not enough time to recruit a substantial amount of motor units when the velocity is so fast. There's just not enough time. There's not enough time for actin and myosin to bind together to produce that force. So that's one reason why during a fast contraction or fast concentric action, force decreases. But on the flip side, during a lengthening velocity, so if we were to lengthen the arm and do it very quickly, that muscle stretches and we actually have greater force production. So you see here at this force curve, force is going to be higher with the eccentric. The main reason that is due to the elastic elements of the muscle. So elastic elements being connective tissue and tighten, and we're activating the stretch reflex. So when we lengthen that muscle very quickly, we're actually going to see greater force production. You see that isometric is in the middle. So it's going to be more than concentric, but less than eccentric force. I also showed this video right here, and I showed how that if I do a very slow kick, that I have a lot of time to recruit motor units. And you see in this graph here that my force, my torque, which is another word for rotational force, is going to be really high. But versus this video right here, when I kick out really quickly, the force is going to drop. And the reason the force drops is because the movement is so fast, there's not enough time for optimal motor unit recruitment. So that's really all that force velocity curve meant. This here goes a little bit more into that, and you do have to know the information on this slide here. So knowing that muscle damage is mainly due to high eccentric loads rather than concentric. And we probably know why. The stretching of that muscle tissue causes micro tears in the muscle, which causes soreness. So EIMD, exercise-induced muscle damage, is mainly due to high eccentric loads. This other question right here says, when is it best to focus on the concentric muscle action? If you remember, it's during, or if we want to train for power. So when we want that muscle to shorten really quickly, That's a characteristic of power production. Versus when do we want to focus on eccentric actions for hypertrophy, so for muscle building, and then also for strength production. Strength, though, we can focus on both eccentric, concentric to have optimal strength production. And this picture right here kind of explains that a little bit more. It talked about high load, low velocity, which is a strength training protocol, and low load, high velocity, which is a power training protocol. And it basically showed how different types of training are going to shift the curve different ways. What you need to know is that we basically need to focus on both aspects of this force velocity curve. We do need to do strength training and we need to do power training, because that's going to result in an optimal shift in this curve. You have to know that the optimal shift means to shift the curve upward and to the right. So as you see in this picture right here. So when we shift the curve upward, it means we're able to produce higher amounts of force. And then when we shift the curve to the right, it means we're able to produce force faster. So more force and at a faster velocity. So yeah, that is the force velocity curve in a very quick demonstration. Okay, next question or next point on the review is strength curves. So strength curves, number one, you just have to know the definitions here. If you need a better explanation, just refer back to the lecture. I go into this in a lot of detail, but you do have to know each of the three curves, and you have to know basically where more force is produced at either the end or at the beginning of the concentric range of motion. So just remember, these strength curves refer to the shortening range of motion, not the lengthening, not the eccentric part. You also need to know examples. So I went over examples in the lecture. I think kind of the best example I gave for ascending was back squat, bench press. Descending, I gave hamstring, so like a hamstring curl, or maybe a lying hamstring curl is going to be a good example. And then for bell-shaped, I said bicep curls. And that gets us to our chapter 4 quiz review. So that quiz is open today. It closes at midnight. So basically everything I just went over could possibly be on there. And then you may have noticed exam 1 has some quiz questions on it. So same as exam 2, it's going to have a few quiz questions from this quiz on the exam. Okay, so continuing with kind of these curves, this one, the length tension relationship. This one is my favorite because it's really easy to understand. It just has to do with the length of the muscle influences how much tension the muscle can produce. And it does go into a lot of, or there's kind of a lot of components that contribute to this relationship. That's a passive tension, active tension. You do have to know the definition, so the difference between active and passive, and then how that creates total tension, which it says right here. And so these pictures down here, like I think I said in the lecture, this one's a little tricky to look at and kind of grasp it, but it's just putting all the tensions together and showing you which one has the highest amount of tension based on the length of the muscle when that tension is produced. I like this one over here. I think the example I gave in the lecture was, again, with the biceps muscle, is when we stretch the bicep out completely, we have very little force. So try to push with your arms completely straight and create force. You're not going to be able to, because there's very little cross bridging in the muscle. They can't attach, which means they can't produce force. There's no sliding filament theory when the muscle is completely stretched out. And then a decreased muscle length, when the bicep is completely short, we also can't produce a lot of force there. There's too much overlap. So optimal length, this optimal resting tension right here, this is where we're going to see the greatest amount of force, because most of the time when we push something, we push with these bent elbows. So there's optimal cross bridging in the muscle, which equals optimal force. So yeah, this relationship's really easy to understand. You do have to know just these basic statements. You'll see some statements about the length tension relationship, and you'll have to know if that's incorrect or if that's a correct statement. So you do have to know a lot about this. knowing that it's based on how much that muscle is actually stretched, and the stretch of the muscle determines the overlap of actin and myosin, and that overlap determines optimal force production. All right, the last curve here is the force time curve. So this curve, obviously, we're looking at force over segments of time. So the example that's shown here is different types of training. We have an untrained person, a heavy strength trained person, and then an explosive power trained person. And we're looking at these curves and they're all a little different. So the red line is those who don't really have any training. So they're able to produce some force, but it takes them a while to produce that force, and they can't produce force very quickly. We look at the heavy strength trained person. They're able to produce a lot of force, but again, they aren't able to produce that force very fast. Now we look at the explosive power trained person. They're still able to produce a significant amount of force, and it's in an optimal time frame. That optimal time frame is that 200 milliseconds. So it just means RFD, rate of force development. How quickly can you produce that force? We said this is ideal in functional movements, like when you're walking and you trip and you have to catch yourself, that's producing force quickly. Or if something's coming at you and you have to move out of the way really fast, you're moving your body at a rapid pace. So that's an example of RFD. Think about that in sports. Sport movements occur so quickly, and we have to be able to produce force in an optimal time frame, or our movement's not going to be very effective. So how do we shift this curve to make it more beneficial? Again, we have to do both types of training. We have to do some heavy strength training and some power training. This curve shifts upward and to the left, which is the opposite of the force velocity curve, which shifted upward and to the right. You do have to know the difference between the two. So if you look here, look at the arrows, we want to go up and we want to go to the right. It means we're producing lots of force in a shorter time frame. So yeah, those are the curves. Just a few more points on the review. Knowing the difference between hypertrophy and hyperplasia. So now we're looking at adaptations to resistance training. We're looking at what's going to happen to the muscle over time with, resistance training. And so hypertrophy, I don't go into a lot of detail in this class. I know your 4305 class will go into a lot more detail about muscle building, but here we know that growth of a muscle is due to synthesis or growth of actin and myosin in size and in number. And that's going to increase number of myofibrils in the muscle fiber, which will make the fiber larger. Therefore, the muscle itself becomes larger. This occurs in humans. It's just your basic muscle growth. Hyperplasia, we know, does not occur in humans, or there's not enough research to support human hyperplasia. But we do know it is the longitudinal splitting of the fiber. So that's really what you have to know, just the difference between the two. Here is just like other effects of endurance training. So what happens to the muscle with high volume endurance training? We already know capillaries, capillary density, myoglobin, mitochondria, ATP. We talked a little bit about this in chapter 3, so I'm not going to spend much time at all going over this, but you probably just need to know adaptations to the muscle. This here, I actually don't think this is on your exam. This is just an interesting topic that I discussed about endurance running and recruitment and changes. But the last thing you do have to know is concurrent training. So we know that concurrent training means exercises that we're doing concurrently or together. So the example here is doing let's say an aerobic workout in the morning and then a resistance training workout in the evening. So if someone who does that over long periods of time, what are their muscle gains and muscle changes going to look like compared to someone who only does aerobic and then compared to someone who only does strength training? There are going to be some differences there. So we said that strength is going to be highest in the resistance trained only athlete and lower in the person who also does the aerobic activity. Same with power and same with hypertrophy. So anytime we're doing aerobic activity, and when I say aerobic, I don't just mean like a 2-mile run on the weekend or, you know, a jog every now and then. I'm talking about high volume, high intensity aerobic exercise. That's going to reduce the effectiveness of our hypertrophic pathways. So it interferes with the ability of the muscle to grow. Which also results, if the muscle is not able to grow, we're probably going to see some reductions in strength and in power. But VO2 is unaffected. So resistance training does actually not hinder our VO2 if we're doing high volume or lots of aerobic exercise. So kind of the point of this is if you want to have high amounts of strength, power, and muscle size, you should probably limit your aerobic activity to just light to moderate intensities and volumes. But if your goal is like aerobic performance and want to be a really good aerobic athlete, you should actually probably incorporate some resistance training into your program because that will prevent muscle loss. It will help you be more powerful during, you know, finishing a race, and it will help you with muscle endurance throughout the entire duration. So yeah, you do have to know concurrent training effects on muscle fitness and muscle fibers. So yeah, I know I went over this super fast. So you had a lecture in 30 minutes. But again, if you need more information, just refer back to that lecture. But now I will open up the class to ask me any question about chapter 4. And so I know some of you, it takes a while to speak, so I'm going to give you a few minutes and let you come up with some questions if you have any for me. Okay? Now I turn it to y'all. I will say one thing that is helpful is if you haven't already completed this worksheet, go ahead and do so. This is under chapter 4, it's in handouts. So this is a handout and it's just like a matching worksheet. This helps you with the definitions. So this chapter, there's a lot of definitions. There's 20 questions here. So I would go ahead and try to match this without using your notes. And so this is another helpful studying tool.
Okay, I got some questions.
Yeah, what's up?
Okay, so it's more like just to clarify questions.
Okay.
So we don't have to know about the staining on the fibers.
You don't have to know about staining, no.
Because I think during like the lecture you said, oh, there's like a quiz question, like on the video, it was like there might be a quiz question over it. And
there may be a quiz question over a staining. I think I know what it is. It's like knowing like transitions and knowing about the myosin heavy chain content,
okay,
and knowing how it's either similar or different between certain fibers.
Okay, cool. And then you said pretty much know like all the components, about the Z lines and all that jazz.
Yes, just
Okay.
basics.
Basically what's on the sheet right there. Sorry, I can't read. And then just like no examples of like resistance training. What's an example of, oh geez, coming with prepared questions. Yeah, so like concentric muscle actions, eccentric muscle actions. What's the activated muscle?
Yes. So there's
right.
This chapter I think is easy. I think it's really straightforward. It's just a lot of definitions and just knowing structures. The hardest part is the curves. It's knowing like the different curves and stuff that occur or happen in the muscle. The only practical questions you'll have is like the concentric, eccentric. So identifying the muscle, the target muscle, and if it's going through an eccentric or concentric action during the movement that I explained. So I think that's an applied question. Another applied question, maybe like is the concurrent training. So like if I do X and X type of training, what's most likely going to happen to my strength or my power or muscle size? So based on the training that I do, what adaptations am I most likely to see?
Okay.
So that's another kind of applied question.
Okay. And then also just like with the curbs, you said, you know, if you do a lot of aerobic, you know, you could see that it could hurt and hinder the muscle growth and everything and even kind of deplete it to a point. And so like, will there probably be some questions like that?
Yeah, yes. So say again, just like if I do this amount of exercise, what's going to happen to my muscle? What's going to happen to my strength? Same with like the curves. So like if I am a power athlete and I do a lot of power training, what's going to happen or what's most likely to happen to the force velocity curve? Which way is it going to shift? And like, what does that mean? So yeah, it's just knowing about those curves and the adaptations. If I do a certain type of training, what's most likely to happen?
Okay.
So yes, I think those are going to be
stuff. Okay.
What?
Pretty straightforward stuff. Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, those are going to be like kind of the trickiest questions, is practically knowing what's going to happen if I'm this type of athlete.
Okay.
The rest is really easy.
Cool. Thank you.
Yes. Anybody else want to talk about anything? Next is I wanted to pull up this picture right here. This is also in the handouts, and this is just like review questions. So just being able to answer these. I know these are fill in the blank and short answer. You know that you won't have any short answer. You will have a few fill in the blank on the exam, but if you can answer these questions, these 17 questions right here, you'll be good. Oh, one thing I actually didn't mention is this question right here. A lot of people, and I probably talked about it already, have this misconception that lactic acid buildup in the muscle causes soreness, and that is not true. So you have to know that muscle soreness is not due to acidity. It's due to, it's due to eccentric actions. It's due to the eccentric type training. Sorry, I've got a lot going on. Right here. This side. Due to eccentric actions. So high muscle damage, eccentric. It's not due to acidity buildup in the muscle. So that's one thing that I didn't talk about, but you should probably already know. But yeah, anything else I can answer for you, go over. I'll give you just a few minutes to just think about a question before we go. Okay, well, if no one has any other questions, then remember to take your quiz today. It's due at midnight. And remember, I will go back in and correct those fill in the blanks. It happens all the time. People put the right answer, but it's counted wrong. So I'll fix that. Just give me some time to do it. Other than that, have a great weekend. I'll send out my email on Sunday, letting you know what to do for week 6. But yeah, y'all have a great time, and yeah, see you guys later.